Look at that skyline. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the Golden Gate Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, Hoover Dam, the hull of every warship that sank a destroyer in the Pacific. All of it, every beam, every girder, every column of structural steel, came from one place. A plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, built on the banks of a river nobody outside the state had ever heard of. At its peak, Bethlehem Steel was the second largest steel producer on the planet. 30,000 people worked there. The blast furnaces ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They never stopped. The fire never went out. The steel never stopped flowing. Then on November 18, 1995, they cast the last pour from Blast Furnace C. Workers and their families stood outside in the cold Pennsylvania air and watched the glow die. Some of them cried. Most just stood in silence, watching the fire go out for the first time in nearly a century. This is the story of Bethlehem Steel, the company that built modern America, and how it was destroyed. The story begins in 1857 in the Lehigh Valley of eastern Pennsylvania, with a company so unimpressive that its first investors immediately regretted getting involved. Augustus Wolfe founded the Saucona Iron Company in April of that year, intending to make railroad rails from the iron or deposits in the surrounding hills. The timing seemed perfect. America was expanding west. Railroads needed steel. Steel needed iron. Iron was sitting right there in the Pennsylvania hills. But the company struggled from the start. Poor management, limited capital, the disruption of the Civil War. By 1861, the Saucona Iron Company had reorganized into the Bethlehem Iron Company, and even that didn't help much. The plant limped through the 1860s and 1870s producing railroad rails at thin margins, never quite finding its footing, never quite dying either. What saved it was the United States Navy. In the 1880s, America looked at its aging wooden fleet and made a decision. The country needed modern steel warships. The Navy issued contracts for armor plate, thick, hardened steel panels that could stop a shell. Almost nobody in America knew how to make it. Bethlehem Iron Company, desperate for revenue, decided to learn. They invested in new equipment. They hired European metallurgists who understood hardened steel. They built new furnaces. And slowly, painfully, they figured it out. By the early 1890s, Bethlehem was the primary supplier of armor plate for the United States Navy. The company that had nearly failed making railroad rails was now building the armor for America's warships. It wasn't glamorous work. The plant was dangerous, loud, and brutal. Workers labored 14-hour shifts in conditions that would horrify anyone today. But it kept the company alive, and it positioned Bethlehem for what was about to happen next. In 1901, a man named Charles Schwab bought Bethlehem Steel Company. He was 40 years old, already famous, already rich, and already in trouble. Schwab had started life as a grocery clerk in rural Pennsylvania. At 19, he talked his way into a job at Andrew Carnegie's steel mill in Braddock. Within 8 years, he was running it. Carnegie called him the best steel man he'd ever met. When Carnegie sold his empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901 to create U.S. Steel, the largest corporation in American history, Schwab was made its first president. He should have been set for life. Instead, within 2 years he was out. Schwab was too independent, too flamboyant, too much his own man for the corporate bureaucracy Morgan had built. He clashed with the board constantly. He gambled in Monte Carlo while executives were supposed to be working. He commissioned a mansion on Riverside Drive in New York City, so enormous it took up an entire city block. Morgan ran a corporation. Schwab wanted a kingdom. In 1903, he resigned from U.S. Steel and turned his attention to Bethlehem. He had purchased a controlling stake in 1901, almost on a whim. Now he looked at this struggling Pennsylvania iron company and saw something nobody else could see. He announced publicly, "I intend to make Bethlehem the prize steelworks of its class, not only in the United States but in the entire world." Most people laughed. Bethlehem was a distant second-tier company up against the industrial giant that was U.S. Steel. But Schwab wasn't building a company. He was building a monument to himself. The first thing he did was listen. He hired workers away from European mills who understood technologies American steelmakers hadn't mastered. He walked the factory floor asking questions. He bought rounds of drinks for workers at local bars on Friday nights and asked them what was wrong with the equipment. The second thing he did was transform what Bethlehem made. An engineer named Henry Gray had developed a method to roll wide-flange steel beams, H-shaped beams that were lighter, wider, and stronger than the riveted beams every other company was making. Gray had been trying to sell the idea to U.S. Steel for years. They ignored him. Schwab immediately understood what it meant. In 1908, Bethlehem Steel began producing America's first commercially successful wide-flange structural beams. It changed everything. The old beams had been assembled by riveting smaller pieces together. Every floor of a skyscraper required thousands of individual rivets, driven by hand by teams of workers in dangerous conditions. Bethlehem's single-piece H-beam was rolled directly from a steel ingot, stronger, faster to install, cheaper to use. A building that had taken 2 years to frame could now be framed in months. By 1913, Bethlehem Steel owned New York. Their chief engineer said it plainly. Bethlehem Steel owned New York. 80% of the steel in the Manhattan skyline came from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The Chrysler Building, the Bank of Manhattan Tower, later the Empire State Building. All of it went up on Bethlehem beams. Schwab had been right. He was building the most important steel company in the world. And he hadn't even started on the wars yet. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, America was officially neutral. But neutrality didn't mean Bethlehem Steel had to stop selling. Britain was running out of artillery shells. France was running out of steel for its fortifications. Russia needed guns. All of them needed ships. And all of them knew that Bethlehem Steel could produce what no one else could, at a scale no one else could match. In 1915, Britain placed a $135 million order with Bethlehem Steel, the largest single contract in the company's history up to that point. Schwab personally traveled to Europe to negotiate. He circumvented American neutrality laws by routing shipments through Canada. By 1917, Bethlehem was producing more war materials than any other private company in the world. The profits were staggering. The plant in Bethlehem ran at absolute capacity, adding shifts, hiring thousands of new workers, running the furnaces at temperatures they were never designed to sustain indefinitely. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was becoming something new. Not just a factory town, but a company ecosystem. Bethlehem Steel owned the houses where workers lived. They owned the stores where workers bought food. The company ran medical clinics. The factory whistle told the whole city what time it was. If you lived within 5 miles of the Lehigh River in those years, your life was organized around the rhythm of the steel plant. When America finally entered the war in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson called Schwab to Washington. He needed someone to run the Emergency Fleet Corporation, the government body responsible for massively accelerating American shipbuilding. Wilson's choice was Schwab. Not a general, not a government bureaucrat. The steel man from Pennsylvania. Schwab accepted. He threw out the cost-plus government contracting system that had been slowing construction and replaced it with fixed-price contracts that rewarded speed. Shipbuilding accelerated dramatically. Historians credit Bethlehem Steel's production capacity as one of the decisive factors in the Allied victory. After the war ended, the plant didn't slow down. The 1920s brought a construction boom that was almost as demanding as the war. New York was building. Chicago was building. Every major American city was reaching upward, and every beam in every new skyscraper needed to come from somewhere. It kept coming from Bethlehem. By 1920, the company employed 20,000 people in the Lehigh Valley alone. Eugene Grace, who Schwab had hired in 1916 to run day-to-day operations, was building the management structure that would carry the company for the next 40 years. Schwab remained the visionary. Grace was the one who actually ran it. Then the Depression hit, and Bethlehem Steel faced its first true test of survival. The stock market crash of 1929 destroyed the construction boom overnight. New skyscrapers stopped going up. Orders for structural steel collapsed. Bethlehem's revenues fell by more than half. Schwab himself, who had spent decades living with the extravagance of a European nobleman, watched his personal fortune dissolve. The mansion on Riverside Drive was eventually seized by creditors. He died in 1939 with over $300,000 in debt. But Bethlehem Steel survived. And not just survived. In the depths of the Depression, it built some of the most iconic structures in American history. The Golden Gate Bridge. 68,000 tons of Bethlehem steel went into that bridge. Workers in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania forged the main cables, the towers, the roadway structure. Everything except the concrete. When the bridge opened in 1937 and San Franciscans walked across it for the first time, they were walking on steel made by men who had never seen the Pacific Ocean. The Hoover Dam, the George Washington Bridge, the University of Pittsburgh's 42-story Cathedral of Learning, the Ben Franklin Bridge, all of them Bethlehem Steel. The Depression was destroying private construction, but Roosevelt's New Deal public works projects kept Bethlehem's furnaces burning. The workers who kept the furnaces running in those years did it under conditions that modern safety regulations would shut down within an hour. Over 500 men died in the Bethlehem plant between 1905 and 1941. Thousands more were burned by molten metal, crushed by machinery, or poisoned by fumes. The company posted notices at the hiring office that said bluntly, "Unless you are willing to be careful to avoid injury to yourself, do not ask for employment. We do not want careless men here." It was a dark joke to the men who worked there. The burns on their bodies were proof that there was no way to be entirely careful. Not in that place. Not doing that work. You wore the wet leather boots and the heavy gloves, and you did your job and you hoped. Mostly men hoped, and mostly men survived, and some didn't, and the furnaces kept burning either way. The Bethlehem plant was built on immigrant labor. Greek workers who had fled genocide in their homelands. Polish and Italian families who had crossed the Atlantic with nothing. Irish laborers 3 generations removed from the famine. They poured into South Bethlehem and created a neighborhood that was more European than American in its first decades. Multiple languages on every block. Churches of 6 different denominations within walking distance of the plant gate. They weren't just workers. They were the community. Their children went to school together. Their grandchildren would end up working in the same plant. Multi-generational employment was the foundation of everything Bethlehem Steel claimed to stand for. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Bethlehem Steel was already running at high capacity. Within weeks, it was running beyond capacity, in ways the engineers said weren't possible, at speeds the metallurgists said weren't sustainable. They were right that it wasn't sustainable. They were wrong that it couldn't be done. The men went to war, and the women came to work. Women who had never been inside a steel plant before were operating lathes, welding stations, and quality control positions that had been exclusively male for decades. They learned fast. They had to. There was no time for hesitation. The plant produced over 1,100 warships during the war. Destroyers, cruisers, carriers, landing craft. The steel for tanks, aircraft engines, artillery barrels, naval gun mountings. Everything a modern industrial war required. President Franklin Roosevelt personally attended the launching of the first Liberty ship at Bethlehem's Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore on September 27, 1941. He named it the SS Patrick Henry, after the man who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." These were Liberty ships in every sense. Then came the contract nobody talked about. From 1949 to 1952, Bethlehem Steel was hired by the United States government to roll uranium fuel rods for nuclear reactors at its Lackawanna, New York plant. The work was classified. The workers were not told what they were handling. They were not given protective equipment specific to uranium. They went home at night covered in metallic dust that nobody told them was radioactive, and they washed it off in their kitchen sinks, and they went to bed, and they came back the next morning and did it again. Some of those workers later developed cancers. Some sought compensation under federal radiation exposure laws passed in 2000. Most received nothing. The government drew a line, and the Bethlehem workers were on the wrong side of it. By the end of World War II, Bethlehem Steel was no longer just a company. It was an institution. It was infrastructure. It was as American as the bridges it had built, and the ships that had won the war, and the skyscrapers that defined every major city's skyline. Nobody who worked there in 1945 could have imagined it would ever end. The 1950s were Bethlehem Steel's golden age. America was building everything simultaneously. Houses for the soldiers coming home. Highways connecting the country. Office buildings in every downtown. Factories for every consumer product suddenly in demand. All of it needed steel. Employment at the main Bethlehem plant peaked at 30,000 workers. The Sparrows Point plant in Maryland was at times the largest single steel-producing facility in the world. The company ran plants in Lackawanna, New York, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Burns Harbor, Indiana. It was an empire of steel stretching across the industrial heartland. The men who worked at Bethlehem in those years describe it the way veterans describe military service. You were part of something enormous, something permanent. Your father had worked there. His father had worked there. You would work there, and your son would work there after you. The plant wasn't just your job. It was your identity, your community, your calendar. The shift whistle told you what time it was. The plant's medical clinic was where your kids got vaccinations. The United Steelworkers Union had negotiated wages that let a single steel worker buy a house, raise a family, take a vacation every summer. The American dream, and it was real, and it was built on steel. But underneath the prosperity, cracks were forming that management either couldn't see or chose to ignore. The first crack was complacency. Bethlehem Steel's management in the 1950s and 1960s was operating on the assumption that the postwar boom would last forever. The basic oxygen furnace technology, developed in Austria in the early 1950s, could produce steel 4 times faster than Bethlehem's older open-hearth furnaces. European and Japanese steel mills rebuilt after the war adopted it immediately. Bethlehem was slow to convert. The second crack was foreign competition. In 1965, for the first time, more than 10 million tons of foreign steel were imported into the United States. Japanese steel mills, rebuilt from rubble with modern equipment and government subsidies, were producing steel at costs American mills couldn't match. The Japanese worked with newer technology, lower labor costs, and the burning determination of a country that had watched its industrial base get bombed flat and rebuilt it better than before. Bethlehem's management responded to foreign competition the way a company responds when it doesn't really believe the threat is serious. They lobbied Congress for tariffs. They blamed unfair foreign trade practices. They denied the fundamental problem, that they were producing steel with older equipment and higher costs than their competitors. The United Steelworkers Union, which had fought heroically for decades to win wages and benefits for the workers who produced Bethlehem's profits, was now locked in negotiations that left management no room to invest in modernization. Every dollar that went to wages and benefits was a dollar that didn't go to new equipment. Both sides were protecting their interests. Nobody was protecting the future. The 1970s hit Bethlehem Steel like a series of body blows, each one arriving before the last had been absorbed. The oil crisis of 1973 drove up energy costs across every industry. Steel production is extraordinarily energy-intensive. Every ton of steel requires enormous quantities of electricity and fuel. When energy prices quadrupled, Bethlehem's cost structure, already strained by foreign competition, became genuinely unworkable. Then came the environmental disasters. Hurricane Agnes flooded the Lehigh Valley in 1972, forcing the closure of the Cornwall iron mine. The Grace mine in Berks County shut down in 1977. Environmental regulations required costly cleanups at multiple facilities. New pollution standards mandated expensive equipment upgrades that management had been avoiding for years. The first major public shock came in August 1977. Bethlehem Steel abruptly announced a 40% cutback in production at the Lackawanna plant outside Buffalo, New York. 3,500 jobs gone. Permanently. Not a temporary layoff. Not a slowdown. Gone. The announcement hit Lackawanna the way only a catastrophe can hit a company town. The plant had employed nearly 20,000 workers in 1965. By August 1977, that number was already down to 11,500. Now it was dropping to 8,000. And everyone in town knew that wasn't where it would stop. A Washington Post reporter went to the bars near the plant after the announcement. He found workers who simply could not believe it. Families had worked at that plant across 4 generations. The Lackawanna Steel Company had opened in 1902, 7 years before the town itself was incorporated. The town had literally grown up around the plant. The idea that the plant could vanish was beyond comprehension for the people who had built their lives around it. One worker, 38 years old, said it simply, "You feel so helpless. Go somewhere else. My father is 73. My mother is 68. All my friends are here. It's not as easy as it sounds to go find heaven somewhere else." For most of them, there was nowhere to go. The steel industry was contracting across the entire region simultaneously. Bethlehem, Republic Steel, U.S. Steel, Youngstown Sheet and Tube. They were all making the same announcement at roughly the same time, in the same cities, to the same communities that had built everything around the assumption that the mills would always be there. In 1982, Bethlehem Steel reported a loss of $1.5 billion. Not a bad year. Not a temporary setback. $1.5 billion in a single year. They shut down the remaining Lackawanna operations completely. The death spiral had begun. The workers who got laid off in 1982 were not young men who could retrain and start over. Many were in their 40s and 50s. Men who had gone to work at the plant at 18, who had spent 25 years becoming experts in processes that no longer existed anywhere in their region. What do you retrain a 50-year-old blast furnace operator to do? Where do you go when the only industry you know has left your city? Most of them didn't go anywhere. They stayed. They watched their savings slowly run out. They watched their neighborhoods hollow out as younger people left. They watched the houses lose value as the tax base collapsed. They were the human cost of a corporate failure that the financial press described entirely in terms of balance sheets and market share percentages. Through the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, Bethlehem Steel tried everything. They exited the railroad car business in 1993. They ended shipbuilding in 1997. They sold off facilities. They restructured debt. They negotiated with the union. They hired consultants. Nothing worked. Mini mills were the new competition nobody had taken seriously until it was too late. Electric arc furnaces could melt scrap steel and produce new steel at a fraction of the cost of a traditional integrated mill. No blast furnaces. No coke ovens. No iron or ships. Just scrap metal, electricity, and a modern furnace. By the mid-1980s, Nucor Steel was building mini-mills in the American South, in states with lower wages and weaker unions, producing standard steel grades at prices Bethlehem couldn't match. In 1987, Nucor partnered with the Japanese company Yamato to build a plant specifically targeting the structural beam market. The market that Schwab had built Bethlehem on, wide-flange structural beams, was being taken by a company using technology Bethlehem's management had dismissed for decades. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. On November 18, 1995, Blast Furnace C produced its final heat of iron. Workers and their families had come to watch. Retirees who hadn't been inside the gates in years came back for the last time. 100 years of fire was ending. Dave Swartz, a beam yard saw operator who had spent his career at the plant, described the moment. When the saw operator made the last final cut, the tears started to come down our eyes, and we hugged everybody. We were sad. And that was the first time we heard the mill silent. A lot of the guys you work with, you're never going to see them again. The last pour. The furnace that had burned for nearly a century went cold. By 1998, all operations at the main Bethlehem plant had ended. The fires that had run without interruption through 2 world wars, the Depression, the Korean War, Vietnam, were finally out. On October 15, 2001, Bethlehem Steel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was the 25th American steelmaking company to file for bankruptcy in the 4 years between 1998 and 2001. 25 companies. An entire industry collapsing simultaneously in the country where that industry had been invented. Bethlehem spokeswoman Bet Kovac said at the time, "It's a sad, painful event. Is this how people who worked for Bethlehem Steel envisioned it would end? No, it's not. No, it was not. The pension crisis that followed was the final insult. For decades, the United Steelworkers Union had negotiated pension benefits that were central to every contract. Workers had accepted lower wages in some years in exchange for guaranteed pension security. The pension was the promise. Give us your working life, and we will take care of your retirement. When Bethlehem filed for bankruptcy, those pension obligations, representing billions of dollars, were assumed by the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that backstops private pension funds. It was the largest pension liability assumption in American history at that time. Retirees received reduced benefits. Some received far less than they had been promised. Workers who had spent 30 years at the plant, who had made every decision about their retirement based on promises the company had made, found those promises had been worth less than the paper they were written on. In 2003, what remained of Bethlehem Steel, 6 massive plants and whatever equipment hadn't been scrapped, was acquired by the International Steel Group of Cleveland for $1.5 billion. The company that had once been worth tens of billions was sold for roughly what it had lost in 1982 alone. The Bethlehem Steel Corporation, founded 1899, was dissolved. What happened to the land? Plans were made. Studies were commissioned. Consultants were hired. Eventually, in 2007, the Bethlehem Steel property on the south side of Bethlehem was sold to a casino company. They built a casino where the plant had stood. A casino on the ground where American workers had forged the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge. The 5 blast furnaces were preserved. They stand today on the Steel Stacks campus, transformed into an outdoor concert venue and arts complex. People gather there on summer evenings to hear music under the rusting towers that once lit the night sky with molten iron. It is both beautiful and heartbreaking, depending on what you know about what happened there. What killed Bethlehem Steel? The easy answer is foreign competition. The harder answer is a series of decisions made over decades that left the company unable to respond when the world changed. Management chose not to modernize. When basic oxygen furnaces were transforming steelmaking in Europe and Japan in the 1950s, Bethlehem's leadership looked at the capital cost and deferred. They calculated that their existing equipment still worked, that demand was still there, that they could extract another decade of profit from the old infrastructure before replacing it. They were thinking in 10-year cycles. Their competitors were thinking in 50-year cycles. They failed to anticipate the mini-mill. Electric arc technology was visible by the mid-1960s. The trajectory was clear to anyone paying attention. Bethlehem's management concluded it was only suitable for low-grade steel and went back to producing structural beams with equipment from the 1940s. By the time they understood what had happened, the market was gone. They couldn't compete on cost. American wages, environmental regulations, and tax structures were all higher than in the countries Bethlehem was competing against. Some of that difference was inevitable. None of it was addressed aggressively enough, soon enough, with the right equipment. And behind all of it, the workers who paid the price for decisions they had no part in making. The men who built the Golden Gate Bridge, who forged the armor plate for warships, who raised families and sent their children to college on wages earned in those furnaces. They had done everything right. They had shown up every morning, worked dangerous jobs without complaint, accepted lower wages in exchange for pension security, given decades of their lives to a company they believed in. The company failed them. Union leader Jerry Green, who worked at Bethlehem for 27 years, said it as simply as it could be said. I never would have believed it in my wildest dreams. I thought Bethlehem was a giant and steel was king. He was right. It was. Until it wasn't. Today, the site where 30,000 workers once built the steel for America is called Steel Stacks. It hosts music festivals. The casino draws visitors from Philadelphia and New York. The blast furnaces are a backdrop for wedding photographs. Young people who have never heard of Charles Schwab or Eugene Grace or the gray mill stand in front of them and take pictures with their phones. The workers who are still alive remember. They remember the heat of the furnaces. They remember the sound of the plant at full production. A sound so constant that when it finally stopped, the silence felt wrong, like something had been removed from the air itself. They remember their fathers and their grandfathers and the pride of making something that would outlast you, that would stand for 100 years in the skyline of a city you would never visit. They are in their 70s and 80s now. When they are gone, Bethlehem Steel will be fully a museum piece, preserved in photographs and oral histories and the rusting furnace towers that nobody had the heart to tear down. The Empire State Building is still standing. The Golden Gate Bridge is still standing. The warships are at the bottom of the Pacific or cut up for scrap decades ago. The men who made all of it are mostly gone. The 5 Bethlehem steel blast furnaces standing against a brilliant Pennsylvania sunset, the Lehigh River gleaming below, the city of Bethlehem in the background, the full weight of what was built and what was lost made visible in a single frame. The furnaces are cold. And somewhere in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, on a summer night, people are sitting in lawn chairs under the rusting towers listening to music, with no idea that the ground beneath their feet was once the most important piece of industrial real estate in the world. That the steel under their city's bridges and inside their tallest buildings came from this exact place, made by the hands of men who believed it would last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Not the fire. Not the company. Not the belief that if you build something right, something permanent, something essential, it will still be here when you're gone. Bethlehem Steel built America, and America forgot it. If you knew someone who worked at Bethlehem Steel, or if you grew up in the Lehigh Valley or Lackawanna or Johnstown and lived with this history, leave a comment. These stories need to be told before the people who remember are gone. If this made you think differently about what we've lost, hit like and subscribe to Traces Forgotten. There are more stories like this one. There always are.